Within this incredibly harsh prehistoric Oligocene environment, absolutely every single successfully acquired meal completely mattered for biological survival. Every beautifully bright ancient morning began with profoundly dangerous, completely unpredictable uncertainty for these massive early terrestrial mammals. Seizing absolutely every single available feeding opportunity could instantly mean successful biological survival within this deeply unforgiving landscape. And unfortunately, absolutely every single predatory or behavioral mistake constantly carried a deeply devastating, completely irreversible fatal cost. Absolutely nothing biological was ever completely wasted throughout this incredibly efficient, deeply competitive ancient North American terrestrial ecosystem. This incredibly harsh ecological reality was perfectly understood, especially by the magnificently opportunistic, completely relentless, giant prehistoric Entelodon. It successfully remained one of the absolute strangest, deeply fascinating giant terrestrial mammals of its brutal ancient age. This magnificent prehistoric creature was an absolutely perfect biological opportunist that almost never willingly ignored excellent feeding opportunities. Sometimes operating as a deeply terrifying, incredibly effective ancient hunter, successfully pursuing extremely vulnerable, heavily exhausted terrestrial prey. Sometimes successfully surviving as a deeply efficient, perfectly adapted scavenger, completely dominating abandoned ancient bloody terrestrial carcass sites. Always operating as an incredibly aggressive, deeply powerful biological competitor, successfully intimidating smaller, highly fearful early terrestrial predators. Ultimately, this beautifully massive, incredibly robust ancient mammal perfectly represented a completely unstoppable, highly adaptable, true evolutionary survivor. For millions of consecutive prehistoric years, that spectacularly successful opportunistic biological survival strategy was absolutely and completely enough. But unfortunately, the beautifully established, deeply reliable ancient Oligocene world was slowly beginning to profoundly and irrevocably change. And eventually, even the absolute ultimate prehistoric biological opportunists simply could not successfully survive these devastating transformations forever. Meet the magnificently unusual prehistoric Entelodon, an incredibly bizarre ancient mammal perfectly built for completely dominating open grasslands. It successfully remains one of the absolute most unusual, deeply fascinating ancient mammals ever discovered by modern science, featuring a massive skull, prominent cheek flanges, and deeply powerful jaws. Its intimidating appearance remained completely unforgettable forever. These spectacular giants successfully roamed across vast prehistoric landscapes, millions of ancient years before modern predators emerged completely. They deeply dominated early terrestrial ecosystems during the beautifully brutal, wildly transformative prehistoric period called the Oligocene epoch. Their highly successful evolutionary relatives spectacularly spread across massive geographical portions, covering both prehistoric Eurasia and North America. Looking at its remarkably robust, deeply frightening profile, many early scientists initially incorrectly assumed it represented giant pigs. But this spectacularly fascinating ancient beast possessed absolutely zero direct genetic relationship toward any modern true pig today. It actually belonged within an entirely different, incredibly unique, completely separate evolutionary branch of prehistoric mammalian biological history. This beautifully bizarre, highly specialized ancient mammalian family completely vanished forever, leaving absolutely nothing truly comparable surviving behind. The spectacularly dynamic ancient world of the magnificent Entelodon was constantly undergoing incredibly profound, completely unprecedented ecological transitions. Deeply ancient, beautifully dense subtropical rainforests were rapidly retreating, gradually surrendering enormous territories toward increasingly dry, open environments. Completely new, highly expansive open woodland environments were beautifully emerging across vast stretches of prehistoric North American landscapes. Consequently, highly diverse ancient mammals were brilliantly beginning to spectacularly flourish throughout these newly formed terrestrial open plains. Spectacular prehistoric biological life aggressively expanded outward, rapidly filling absolutely every single newly available open terrestrial ecological niche. Enormously heavy, primitive rhinoceros-like herbivores peacefully roamed across these beautifully vast, continuously expanding dry, ancient grassland ecosystems. Meanwhile, incredibly energetic smaller mammals brilliantly thrived amid scattered vegetation, representing absolutely abundant, available daily predatory food resources. Highly specialized early predators closely followed this shifting biological abundance, constantly seeking completely new daily terrestrial hunting opportunities. Despite increasing environmental aridity, spectacular flowing river valleys permanently remain the absolute most vital, sustaining centers of life. Absolutely every prehistoric animal desperately depended upon this highly concentrated, incredibly essential natural freshwater source for daily survival. However, during deeply harsh seasonal droughts, these absolutely critical biological survival resources were sadly never completely naturally guaranteed. Fierce biological competition constantly shaped daily survival within these increasingly unpredictable, highly demanding ancient Oligocene terrestrial woodland ecosystems. A highly valuable fallen carcass wonderfully created sudden nutritional opportunity, attracting numerous desperate species almost completely entirely instantly. Whenever such spectacular natural opportunities unexpectedly arose, the remarkably massive, deeply intimidating Entelodon absolutely never casually ignored them. This profoundly transformative, deeply challenging ancient environment heavily rewarded absolute biological flexibility above all other specialized evolutionary traits. Because this spectacular Oligocene landscape was constantly evolving, only the absolute most highly adaptable terrestrial creatures ultimately survived. Standing majestically above sweeping dry plains, this giant perfectly understood how to successfully dominate shifting ancient environmental boundaries. Ultimately, absolutely few prehistoric mammals proved themselves significantly more biologically flexible than the magnificently opportunistic, powerful ancient Entelodon. Long before the magnificent Entelodon successfully appeared, this deeply ancient prehistoric world actually looked absolutely completely different. Incredibly dense, deeply ancient prehistoric forests completely dominated almost every single available terrestrial landscape across the continent. Hidden among thick vegetation, the earliest primitive ancestors of many spectacular modern mammals were still quietly evolving. However, because a natural biological evolution absolutely never stands completely still, these deeply ancient environments eventually shifted dramatically. Certain highly specialized early mammalian lineages began successfully following an entirely different, incredibly fascinating new evolutionary path. As consecutive prehistoric generations passed, their magnificent physical bodies slowly underwent deeply profound, completely necessary structural changes. Their incredibly robust lower jaws progressively became significantly stronger, perfectly adapting toward successfully crushing highly resistant materials. Simultaneously, the vast ancient environment itself was dramatically transforming into an increasingly open, beautifully complex terrestrial landscape. For these uniquely specialized early Entelodon ancestors, absolute biological adaptability rapidly became an incredibly profound evolutionary advantage. Absolutely fierce biological competition ruthlessly shaped every single subsequent generation throughout these dramatically shifting, deeply unforgiving ecosystems. Eventually, millions of continuous prehistoric years of natural evolution successfully produced something absolutely extraordinary and beautifully terrifying. A spectacularly massive, incredibly adaptable ancient mammal, brilliantly built completely perfectly for seizing absolutely every survival opportunity. Despite bearing remarkable superficial resemblances toward modern wild boars, Entelodon absolutely belonged within an entirely different mammalian lineage. This incredibly fascinating ancient beast was actually somewhat more closely related toward modern hippopotamuses and massive swimming whales. Furthermore, classifying this spectacular creature simply as an apex terrestrial predator remains absolutely biologically incorrect and deeply misleading. Instead, Entelodon wonderfully filled a profoundly flexible, highly unpredictable ecological niche throughout the harsh ancient Oligocene grassland environment. Whenever nutritious vegetation appeared abundantly available, these magnificent giants effortlessly consumed endless prehistoric roots, fruits, and seasonal foliage. Yet whenever a fresh, bloody carcass unexpectedly presented itself, Entelodon quickly became an aggressively dominant, deeply terrifying scavenger. Using its incredibly massive physical bulk, it successfully intimidated smaller primary carnivores into completely abandoning their fresh kills. If environmental conditions suddenly shifted drastically, this profoundly adaptable survivor immediately discovered completely new, daily dietary nutritional resources. It successfully operated as a wildly unpredictable biological wildcard that absolutely never willingly ignored any daily feeding opportunity. Ultimately, its absolute greatest prehistoric weapon was never raw predatory strength, but rather its deeply relentless, cunning adaptability. Its absolute greatest prehistoric biological weapon was completely never raw physical strength, but rather pure, completely unmatched opportunity. Absolutely everything regarding this spectacular prehistoric giant wonderfully served exactly one completely singular, deeply fundamental daily survival purpose. Its absolute most strikingly recognizable physical feature permanently always remained that incredibly massive, deeply robust, elongated bony skull. These spectacular massive jaws could open remarkably wide, brilliantly utilizing one highly specialized, deeply powerful internal hinge joint. Enormous jaw muscles anchored beautifully along its wide temporal openings effectively provided an absolutely devastating, completely unmatched bite. Large interlocking incisors and thick, tusk-like canines perfectly grabbed and then deeply punctured completely resistant biological materials. Sharp triangular premolars effectively sheared tough flesh, while perfectly low, rounded molars beautifully crushed bone and hard vegetation. Those profoundly bizarre lateral cheek flanges and bony jaw tubercles provided massively increased surface area for essential musculature. These distinct lateral facial bony outgrowths also beautifully protected delicate internal structures during incredibly violent, aggressive, intraspecific combat. Successfully supporting this heavy cranial weaponry demanded incredibly powerful neck muscles anchored beautifully along massively elongated spinal vertebrae. Highly enlarged internal olfactory bulbs wonderfully granted Entelodon an absolutely spectacular, deeply acute prehistoric sense of distant smell. Forward-facing front eye sockets brilliantly provided stereoscopic binocular vision, allowing completely perfect depth perception during active pursuits. Beyond its deeply terrifying head, its remarkably athletic body featured completely fused lower leg bones for incredible stability. Long, incredibly slender legs, successfully ending with two functional hooves, beautifully allowed highly efficient, profoundly relentless cursorial movement. This highly specialized anatomical design beautifully favored deeply relentless travel endurance, rather than incredibly rapid, short sprinting bursts. Walking completely effortlessly across vast open prehistoric plains successfully maximized its absolute chances of finding unpredictable daily meals. Combining incredible cursorial endurance alongside highly adaptable, deeply powerful dentition brilliantly created the absolute ultimate biological opportunistic survivor. Its truly magnificent biological body was never built for absolute predatory perfection, but rather for completely unmatched versatility. Every single anatomical physical feature wonderfully synchronized together, permanently transforming Entelodon into an absolutely spectacular ancient survival machine. Every brilliantly bright prehistoric morning consistently began with completely unpredictable, deeply dangerous uncertainty across these vast dry grasslands. This magnificent giant continuously traversed enormous distances daily because its deeply relentless search for food absolutely never ended. Absolutely everywhere it actively roamed, completely diverse ancient mammalian herds beautifully represented potentially vital daily terrestrial feeding opportunities. However, successfully surviving meant carefully determining whether specific risky biological pursuits were actually practically worth completely aggressively attempting. Using highly advanced olfactory senses, Entelodon brilliantly tracked invisible scent trails, wafting quietly across the dry open landscape. Fossilized footprints beautifully reveal their incredibly methodical, deeply strategic, zigzagging search patterns designed for detecting hidden nutritional resources. Sometimes a wonderfully nutritious, abandoned carcass unexpectedly appeared directly alongside meandering riverbanks beneath the warm morning golden sunlight. Whenever Entelodon confidently approached, significantly smaller, deeply terrified scavengers immediately retreated quickly towards safer surrounding dense woodland vegetation. Using immensely powerful jaws, this spectacular survivor quickly consumed highly nutritious meat and completely crushed totally resistant bones. Its profoundly intimidating physical size effectively guaranteed absolutely undisputed dominance over virtually any freshly discovered ancient terrestrial carcass. Yet despite securing substantial nutrition, one completely successful meal absolutely never successfully guaranteed finding another fresh carcass tomorrow. Therefore, the deeply relentless, incredibly exhausting daily biological search systematically resumed beneath the intensely hot, prehistoric afternoon sun. Entelodon thoroughly investigated scattered woodland edges, casually consuming highly abundant roots, seasonal fruits, and tough, fibrous terrestrial vegetation. Whenever it unexpectedly emerged from dense thickets, highly fearful smaller prey animals desperately scattered completely uncontrollably, absolutely everywhere. Possessing incredibly acute stereoscopic binocular vision, this brilliant opportunist vigilantly monitored absolutely every single subtle, terrestrial environmental movement. This exceptional biological awareness frequently revealed totally unexpected nutritional resources hidden perfectly within the constantly shifting ancient ecosystem. But incredibly dangerous daily survival challenges absolutely did not exclusively involve actively finding sufficient food or pursuing prey. Fierce intra-specific competition between rival entelodons frequently erupted suddenly into extremely violent, heavily destructive territorial face-biting battles. Their heavily armored, significantly enlarged bony cheek flanges brilliantly protected vulnerable facial structures during these completely terrifying standoffs. Eventually, exhausted, weaker individuals sensibly retreated quickly, heavily prioritizing long-term biological survival over immediate aggressive territorial dominance. As golden sunlight began beautifully fading horizontally, the relentlessly active giant continued systematically surveying the vast open landscape. Incredibly relentless behavioral persistence effectively maximized its absolute chances of successfully discovering another crucial daily biological survival resource. Reacting almost instantly towards sudden distant movements beautifully demonstrated exactly why this magnificent opportunist remained perfectly dominant. Life remained completely unforgiving throughout this spectacularly diverse, incredibly crowded, ancient Oligocene, North American terrestrial early mammalian ecosystem. But Entelodon possessed unmatched behavioral adaptability, successfully exploiting whatever totally unpredictable opportunity the harsh environment unexpectedly, graciously provided. Striding majestically across the cooling prehistoric plains, few ancient creatures ever completely understood terrestrial opportunity any significantly better. For millions of consecutive years, this remarkably flexible, deeply aggressive behavioral survival strategy proved absolutely flawlessly, perfectly successful. But eventually, absolutely no biological evolutionary strategy can successfully outlast deeply profound, completely permanent, global physical environmental transformations. Magnificent evolutionary success can tragically hide deeply profound, completely fatal vulnerabilities within rapidly shifting, ancient Oligocene grassland environments. Even the absolute ultimate prehistoric opportunist still deeply depended upon finding consistently reliable daily biological food survival resources. But unfortunately, that beautifully vibrant, heavily populated ancient terrestrial world was slowly beginning to profoundly, irreparably, physically change. Previously reliable, highly nutritious daily food sources mysteriously became increasingly unpredictable, absolutely difficult, and dangerously totally scarce. Vital daily feeding opportunities simply became significantly harder to successfully locate across these increasingly harsh, expanding, dry plains. The deeply familiar ancient environment continued relentlessly evolving, transforming previously dense woodlands into extremely dry, highly barren landscapes. Completely new, highly specialized mammalian species were simultaneously rapidly appearing throughout this fiercely competitive, beautifully shifting ancient ecosystem. Consequently, intense biological competition for increasingly rare daily survival resources was steadily growing significantly more, absolutely overwhelmingly dangerous. Profoundly shrinking terrestrial resources constantly forced multiple desperate prehistoric animals together into highly restrictive, fiercely, violently contested territories. Entelodon desperately wandered through increasingly unfamiliar, deeply challenging ancient landscapes, discovering its legendary biological flexibility, slowly inevitably failing. The perfect ecological balance that previously heavily favored Entelodon was now completely, irrevocably, and absolutely tragically disappearing forever. Eventually, even the absolute greatest prehistoric biological opportunist was tragically running completely irreversibly out of viable survival opportunities. The beautifully established, deeply reliable ancient Oligocene world continued relentlessly changing, creating an absolutely unprecedented profound ecological pressure. Expanding dry prehistoric grasslands aggressively replaced beautifully dense, ancient woodland habitats, dramatically shifting fundamental terrestrial ecological balances completely. Highly specialized, completely unfamiliar new mammalian species rapidly arrived, successfully spreading completely across these severely transforming ancient landscapes. Watching distant rival animals thoughtfully, Entelodon slowly realized its incredibly powerful traditional evolutionary advantages were rapidly actively fading. Familiar prey populations gradually moved into completely different, significantly less accessible terrestrial habitats, desperately seeking better nutritional survival. Searching endlessly across violently expanding open plains, the magnificently adaptable opportunist unexpectedly found almost absolutely zero biological success. Extremely harsh seasonal droughts fundamentally systematically devastated the beautifully complex landscape, making basic terrestrial survival profoundly incredibly difficult. Previously reliable ancient riverbeds completely dried into beautifully cracked, completely empty, profoundly barren, deeply silent terrestrial earthen scars. Desperate biological competition heavily intensified as multiple starving mammalian species aggressively surrounded completely increasingly scarce remaining terrestrial carcasses. Confronting new highly intelligent predatory rivals beneath darkening prehistoric skies, Entelodon understood absolutely every single daily meal mattered. Standing absolutely exhausted beside deeply empty vast plains, the tremendous physical cost of continuous survival profoundly dramatically increased. The magnificent Oligocene landscape was actively becoming an incredibly hostile, beautifully sorrowful, completely fundamentally unrecognizable, changing prehistoric environment. Moving significantly slower through endlessly shifting tall, dry grass, older giants found traditional feeding opportunities entirely completely disappearing. Distant migrating mammalian herds beautifully crossed the golden horizon, relentlessly carrying precious biological energy completely permanently far away. Looking deeply into an incredibly uncertain world, this spectacularly powerful biological survivor possessed absolutely zero viable remaining options. Millions of beautifully continuous prehistoric evolutionary successful years tragically could not successfully stop massive, fundamental terrestrial environmental transformations. Wandering completely alone across increasingly desolate ancient terrain, the beautifully magnificent giant biological survivors slowly tragically became fewer. Beneath sadly fading golden sunlight, the previously thunderous, highly active ancient grassland slowly grew profoundly, beautifully, peacefully quiet. Standing silently atop a dusty prehistoric ridge beneath dark, ominous clouds, its legendary ancient biological age ultimately ended. Looking steadily across the beautiful, profoundly changing golden horizon, its famously endless, opportunistic terrestrial feeding possibilities completely vanished. As another beautifully magnificent golden sunset tragically faded, the relentless ancient landscape permanently moved forward without the giant. The incredibly massive, deeply powerful, familiar, prehistoric silhouette slowly disappeared completely into blowing, dusty, ancient terrestrial environmental shadows. Dawn broke peacefully over utterly empty terrestrial grasslands, beautifully signaling an absolutely silent, completely profound biological evolutionary transition. Highly aggressive ancient territories were beautifully, peacefully reclaimed by entirely completely natural, deeply relentless, shifting ecological forces. Lonely prehistoric winds swept emotionally through wonderfully expansive dry grasslands, completely replacing previous thunderous giant terrestrial mammalian footsteps. This spectacularly massive, incredibly adaptable ancient survivor tragically could not successfully change alongside its completely dramatically shifting world. Standing absolutely beautifully empty beneath fading twilight, the deeply relentless prehistoric landscape finally successfully defeated the ultimate opportunist. Stretching endlessly beneath an emotionally beautiful, profoundly darkening ancient sky, the magnificent age of Entelodon permanently concluded completely. Millions of consecutive years beautifully passed, successfully transforming these deeply ancient, thunderous terrestrial environments completely peacefully forever today. Yet spectacularly profound, deeply fascinating prehistoric biological traces miraculously survived, beautifully hidden completely perfectly beneath solid ancient stone. Slowly emerging from dense terrestrial sediment, its magnificently intimidating, incredibly massive fossilized skull absolutely always permanently commands respect. Dedicated modern scientists incredibly patiently excavate these beautifully preserved skeletal remains, profoundly seeking completely new biological evolutionary answers. Resting magnificently inside quiet natural museums, this spectacularly massive, deeply powerful jawbone continuously brilliantly inspires absolute human wonder. These highly revealing, profoundly remarkable fossilized bones successfully allow modern researchers to beautifully reconstruct an absolutely vanished opportunist. Absolutely no single living biological animal surviving today truly resembles this beautifully bizarre, highly aggressive prehistoric terrestrial giant. Although its deeply unforgiving ancient Oligocene environment disappeared completely forever, its spectacularly fascinating evolutionary legacy powerfully continues forward. Looking incredibly closely upon these magnificent ancient remains, we beautifully uncover one spectacularly relentless, deeply successful survival story. Through brilliant modern scientific visualization, this magnificently unique prehistoric biological terrestrial world beautifully returns toward vibrant life today. We must permanently remember Entelodon absolutely not as some terrifying monster, but rather representing one flawlessly adaptable opportunist. It beautifully represented a spectacularly massive, profoundly relentless ancient survivor, completely dominating one deeply harsh, constantly shifting landscape. Its beautifully tragic fossilized legacy permanently reminds us that incredibly profound terrestrial environmental changes ultimately conquer absolutely everything.